The internet in China is very different to what we're used to in the West. Stepping off the plane in China, you find you no longer have access to apps such as Facebook, Instagram, Messenger, and Uber. Over the years, the Chinese have developed their own versions of them.
Over the decades, China developed equivalent versions of these applications, such as Weibo, Meituan, Alipay, Didi, and others. And in some cases, these versions could even be said to have overtaken Western technological solutions. For example, with online payments. And these apps created and developed by Chinese tech firms work well and are more widely used than the other ones we know. The fact that the social media sites and websites that we use are not in China makes the Chinese internet one of the most closed-off ecosystems. For example, sites such as Facebook and YouTube left China around 2009. But in Russia, Meta was only blocked in 2022, and YouTube is still available and is often used as a search engine. The biggest difference in how social media works in the West and in China is visible in the speed with which certain content disappears, meaning that the state apparatus works effectively and quickly to delete the content, to censor it. And that's why when you find some important information on Weibo or WeChat, you need to take a screenshot very quickly, because you don't know how long it will be there for.
Already in 1997, China started work on the legal framework defining what can be published online. However, they still didn't have the technical solutions to block access to Western sites.
In order to fence off the Chinese online ecosystem, the Chinese mainly used American technologies. Cisco played a crucial role here. In the 2000s, this American company significantly increased the sale of routers and other technologies to China. And the Chinese used this as the basis to create the Golden Shield project, which to a large extent led to the Chinese internet being gradually cut off from Western media. Leaked documents from Cisco later showed that the company was aware of what it was participating in, but profit was more important. The situation is well described by Lenin's statement, that capitalists will sell us the rope with which we'll hang them. In the leaked documents of one Cisco presentation, it is clearly written that the technologies being exported to China will be used to limit the flow of information on the Chinese internet, and also for the repression of Falun Gong. At the time, this cult was highly clamped down on in China, and modern technologies were among the tools being used to repress cult members.
Over 1 billion people in China use the internet. That's 74% of society. If we want to understand how China managed to take control of its internet so quickly, we need to go back to the 1990s. The internet first appeared in China in 1994, mainly in universities.
Although the internet in China didn't appear until 1994, that didn't slow down the sentencing of the first person in China 5 years later for the publication of content contradictory to party guidelines. This person was sentenced to jail in 1999. It was a pro-democracy activist who distributed an online newsletter in China, a manifesto of the Democratic Party in China, which was at the time trying to be registered in Hangzhou. The Chinese Communist Party very quickly understood that the internet could lead to social unrest. This was about a decade after the massacre at Tiananmen Square, which till now is described in official Communist Party documents as a kind of operation for peaceful evolution intended to topple the Chinese Communist Party's regime in China. The party state apparatus then began to seriously consider how the external threats linked to the internet could affect internal stability, above all, the stability of the Chinese Communist Party in China. They determined that they needed to quickly put a certain legal framework in place regarding how the internet should develop. The main difference now between how the internet developed in the West and how it developed in China is the fact that, in the West, at the beginning, government intervention played a minor role in its formation. But in China, the party-state apparatus very quickly started to regulate the online sphere. There was a visible break around 2010 when smartphones became widespread in China. The Chinese skipped the era of having big computers which took up half your desk because they were too expensive and in short supply. But when smartphones became popular, internet access grew significantly in China. Simply put, smartphones were much cheaper and more widely available. This in turn led to a significant increase among the Chinese population in their access to digital services and created many opportunities. First of all, domestic Chinese tech firms started to appear, and they gathered huge amounts of data because a growing number of the Chinese population had access to the internet. Secondly, the documents of the State Council of the People's Republic of China started to contain entries claiming that the internet is a huge opportunity to digitize the economy and accelerate China's economic growth. However, from the perspective of censorship in China, the idea of monitoring internet content and the popularization of smartphones led to a lot of problems. The first was the appearance of social media platforms, such as Fanfo and Weibo, which is China's equivalent of Twitter. Videos concerning controversial topics, which the party state apparatus would prefer not to be widespread, were being widely circulated. For example, there were many posts about cases of local corruption. And as time passed, the discussion started to grow around whether allowing this content on the Chinese internet could lead to social unrest. As all this progressed, one of the turning points was when protests broke out in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang, in 2009. The protests from the Uyghur population were brutally stamped out by local police. In the Chinese media, both online and in the legacy media, this event was subjected to strict censorship.
But the Western sites then active in China provided balanced reports on the protests. The Chinese censor had no control over their content. Due to this, Facebook and YouTube were banned in China in 2009, and only Google remained.
Google
adapted itself to Chinese censorship for many years. It chiefly explained that while blocking access to certain content was contradictory to Google's mission, leaving the Chinese market altogether would mean Chinese people had even more limited access to a lot of content. And that's why Google fought for this market.
Operation Aurora changed this. It was a series of cyber attacks in 2010, and Google was among the victims.
Google
was one of 20 companies in the West which were hit by this operation. But it was the only company which officially admitted that its trade secrets were leaked and that China was behind the operation. Overall, it's a very well-known operation in the history of cybersecurity because it's one of the first operations on this scale where the aim was strictly industrial espionage. Google also said that a lot of information was stolen from the inboxes of pro-democratic human rights defenders, people of Chinese origin, but who were outside of China and using those inboxes. Google falling victim to this operation ultimately led to it leaving the Chinese market. But it wasn't the most important thing for China and the party apparatus. This issue had very strong international implications, and at the time in China, it was understood that internet censorship is not merely a matter of China's internal politics. It also has strong international implications. In 2010, just after Google left the Chinese market, Hillary Clinton gave a famous speech about internet freedom, the Open Internet Agenda. Clinton appeared as a kind of spokesperson for the internet as an item which should be available to everyone, open, and which will lead to the development of humankind. China interpreted these actions as a direct threat. This also led to the re-emergence of a very intensive debate in China on how technological dependence on the West, and in particular the US, could in the long term damage internal stability, above all the rule of the Chinese Communist Party.
This tension grew over time, with a rift occurring in 2013 when Edward Snowden testified that the NSA spied on Huawei. This happened when Xi Jinping was taking the reins in China. At the beginning of his rule, he stressed that if China is to follow a stable course of development, then it needs to be technologically independent. This launched an era of dynamic change in the law related to online activity and of influence on homegrown tech firms.
Over time, Chinese tech companies became so powerful that China's influence on the global stage meant that other companies began to emulate Chinese solutions related to online censorship.
In 2017, a law came into force regarding cybersecurity. In China, this term has a broader meaning than in the West and encompasses the monitoring of online content and other issues which the party feels are important.
I żeby to uzmysłowić, podać jakiś konkretny przykład.
There's one very good example of this. The Marriott hotel chain was accused of breaching China's cybersecurity law, which prohibits any individual or company from activity that undermines the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. This was because it distributed a survey to its clients which mentioned Tibet, Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan as separate countries. Later on, in 2021, China introduced the Personal Information Protection Law and Data Protection Law. These were largely based on the EU's solution in this area, such as the GDPR. However, the Chinese Communist Party is excluded from this data processing regime. The party always has access to data. It doesn't matter what the law is. That's how it works in practice. And this law served various purposes. Firstly, it had a very strong impact on how Western companies functioned in China. The best example of this is that transferring data outside of China is strictly limited. But this law also made it possible to impact China's homegrown tech firms. Since 2020, there's been a kind of apparatus repression against their big tech companies. This is because over time, big tech started to become a kind of center of power in China. And the Chinese Communist Party doesn't like to share its power. The decision was taken to end this monopoly with one symbolic event which heralded the beginning of this entire repression apparatus, and was perhaps also a catalyst for it. Jack Ma, the most famous Chinese businessman and the founder of Alibaba, appeared in 2020 at the Shanghai Forum and criticized the Chinese regulators and Chinese banks, saying that they have a pawn-shop mentality and that they apply regulations which are impossible to implement and suffocate the technology sector in China. He said this in front of many important Chinese dignitaries, and in doing so, crossed a red line. For the average Chinese person, Jack Ma is a symbol of success. The legend about him is that he was an English teacher, that he later applied to work in KFC but was rejected. But he never gave up and finally established Alibaba, which was a huge success, and in time became the biggest tech company in China. It turned out, however, that even Jack Ma was not untouchable. After his speech at the forum, he disappeared. For many months, no one knew what he was doing. He didn't participate in public life, while previously he'd been very active in the media, including social media. But for many months, no one knew what had happened to him. Not only did his personal life change a lot after this speech, but also the business he was running drastically changed. Alibaba, specifically Alipay, which was one of the mobile payment apps owned by Jack Ma, was supposed to have its IPO. It was supposed to be a huge success and expected to break some records, but it was ultimately suspended because Alipay was accused of regulatory abuse. This was something of a prelude. Later on, other Chinese companies like Meituan and Didi were punished in China under the law I mentioned earlier. The cases often concern the incorrect processing of personal data and monopolistic practices. This law has served the purpose of curbing the monopoly of technology companies. However, it must also be acknowledged that there have been improvements for many Chinese people. At one point, technology companies in China began to shape algorithms in, for example, food delivery apps in such a way that they created very negative social phenomena in China. One of them could even be described as modern-day slavery. Food deliverers or couriers had delivery targets set in such a way that they were virtually impossible to meet. And also, the rest hours were notoriously violated. In China, the enforcement of labor laws is limited. Hence, this law meant a real change for the better for some Chinese people. But from the party's point of view, and from the point of view of internet censorship, it has served one further purpose. Namely, it has even more strongly involved Chinese technology companies in what content should and shouldn't be promoted on the Chinese internet. In March 2022, the Algorithm Recommendation Regulation came into force in China, under which technology companies were obliged to restrict content that is incompatible with the party message, such as political activism, celebrity glorification, or the display of a very lavish lifestyle, all of which is incompatible with Xi Jinping's advocacy of common prosperity. These technology companies have also been obliged to promote good energy or spread good energy. This is how it's worded in the Chinese law. No one quite knows what this means, but in practice, the algorithm recommendation, that is, the content that is recommended to users in China, should be in line with patriotic and socialist values. This does not mean, however, that since then the internet in China has become some kind of caricature, that the national anthem plays wherever you click. This is done in a more intelligent way. Algorithms are shaped and programmed in such a way that sometimes the user may not be fully aware that so much content is restricted. and some is promoted in a certain way. Over the years, China has become so influential internationally, but also technologically, that its applications are able to compete successfully with Western ones. Here, the best example is TikTok, which is an important soft power tool for China. Let's look at what's happening in Taiwan, for example. Even though Taiwan is often a victim of disinformation from China, and the people there are highly aware of the dangers of disinformation activities, TikTok is still a popular app in Taiwan, and even played its part in the presidential campaign. It took place at the beginning of January, and one of its candidates, Ko Wen-je, was very adept at using TikTok. He had more than 170,000 observers. Although he had no chance of winning from the very beginning and eventually came in third, he did reach a lot of young voters through TikTok. In contrast, the winner, William Lai, did not have TikTok because his party was very much opposed to the app from the very beginning. The Nationalist Party of China in Taiwan has its own TikTok and also uses it efficiently. In contrast, its candidate, Hou You-yi, doesn't have an account. TikTok is also a tool of cultural soft power in Taiwan, if only due to the fact that on TikTok, Chinese influencers are often challenged to sing a certain song. The hits that are performed by Chinese artists are very high on the Spotify charts in Taiwan. Interestingly, often even more popular than stars like Taylor Swift, who is really a phenomenon in East Asia. It's TikTok that makes this Chinese pop culture spread through Taiwan as well. Another example is Russia. TikTok is also present there, and it's a popular app. Not as popular as Telegram, but it still works well. Russian YouTubers and TikTokers also often publish content that is to some extent about China. In recent weeks, for example, Ilya Varlamov, a Russian YouTuber, published a series of videos that portrayed China in a very positive light. He talked about how the very extensive camera surveillance system on Chinese streets is nothing bad, because if you're a decent person, you should not be afraid of anything. So TikTok is also a kind of soft power tool in the hands of China, which is used for various purposes.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, you may also enjoy our previous video about the Chinese demographic catastrophe. The link is available on screen now.